managed all my expectations. Good morning, everyone. My name is Davida Ingram, and I am not quite sure if everyone who joined today got a chance to see the opening video. The theme for today was intersectional education, and I'm an artist and a cultural worker and a producer. So one of the things that I thought might be helpful to do was to begin by talking story. I realized, just on a funny level, that I dated a man in grad school who had been in love with Kimberly Crenshaw. So I met her while I was studying at a dinner party. And the man that I was dating, I was about maybe 15 or 16 years younger than him. So I feel like when I met her, she kind of smiled at me in a really kind of sweet, funny way, but I think she had some thoughts for the guy I was dating. But I didn't know when I met her, the currency of the phrase that she coined would have such significance. And I also wanted to kind of begin by saying one of the reasons why I started the story the way I did is that I think the value of what Kimberly did, and also the value of many Black women who participate in Black radical imagination in a framework of liberation, is to help us to, on one level, understand that the way we codify identities and hierarchy by law is exclusionary. So what she basically did was to help in terms of discrimination and harassment to prove that when it comes to gender, we often only think of white women as women proper, and we make Black women unimaginable. And when we think of race, we tend to gender that as Black men. And so I think in our current moment where the social death that comes with white supremacy is so incredibly on display, not just through COVID, not just through the uprisings, not just through the Trump administration, but because we're just going through a larger reckoning. People may be understanding things differently. And I want to work with the format that we're in, which is kind of designed, I guess, for me to speak for a little bit. So I'm going to talk maybe for about 10 minutes more and then open up the floor. What I'd love to encourage anyone who is joining to do is to use the chat. I'm going to pause. Someone's asking, is the sound on? Is everyone able to hear?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. I was like, we're out of Mercury and retrograde, so I'm hoping that technology will be kind. But I was basically saying, if you want to use the chat to share some of your questions, I think I am at capacity with the pandemic, so I didn't add questions to the is it Wova, the app that we're using?
Yeah.
But I put two questions in the chat. One was, what identities do you see being close to social death in the US, and at what intersections? Because I'm very curious how you're thinking of intersectionality. And I also want to back up, and because I just dived in because I was nervous, but so much of the video that I shared was grounded in my lived experience as being an African-American woman who happens to be an artist, who happens to be queer, who happens to be part of the Northern migration, and who's lived in the Pacific Northwest for 15 years. And one of the beautiful things about living in the Pacific Northwest that I've appreciated is it's rare these days for me to talk about Black experience without acknowledging that I'm on Indigenous lands. And that on these Indigenous lands, when we think intersectionally, we definitely understand in Seattle that we're on Duwamish lands, but we also understand that when settlers came and burned longhouses, that they displaced people who were part of these ancestral lands. So that includes the Muckleshoot and the Tulalip tribes. And of course, Chief Selt was someone who was a unifier. So we are tied not only to Duwamish folks, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip, but also Suquamish and beyond. And Coast Salish is a language group. So I just want to begin with that acknowledgement. and also some hopefulness, because as we in the US reckon, I think with the death experience of being in a settler state, this, I believe personally, that is in a space of transforming, that what is really going to happen is that we get to watch, in a cyclical way, I hope, watch a life cycle emerge for Indigenous communities where their numbers can grow. So they won't always be 1% of the population. And I would say one gratitude that I have for coming to the Pacific Northwest from Chicago is living in Chicago as a little girl, 1 out of 3 Black people, well, 1 out of 3 people in the city that I lived in was Black. And there is a definite prophylactic that comes with being in a community that shares your lived experiences. Moving to Seattle, I constantly dealing with noticing that social death is much realer to me in Seattle, because a lot of the cultural soils that I've grown up with aren't as replenished as I'm used to them being. So I talk about that, but also with a lot of care and respect for people who were born and raised in Seattle, because they have an ability to contend with white supremacy that I think is resilient, and that I've learned a lot from. So when it comes to intersectionality, I wrote a couple different things down just as notes. You won't see them, but I wrote them down on a whiteboard because I wanted to make sure that I mentioned all of these things. One is, again, Kimberly Crenshaw's definition of intersectionality was just simply a way of us not using whiteness as a default and understanding the lensing of race, gender, sexuality, economic class. It's not an endless listing of identities. It's actually understanding the intersections in law of when you become invisible or close to death. That's me paraphrasing. I would say as a person, and I often go back to lived experience, I see intersectionality as more of a GPS. It's not the journey. So I don't expect everyday Black people to turn to academics to decode their life, or anyone who's marginalized for that matter. But I do think it's important for us as people who care about having a meaningful life and understanding when death is natural and when it's unnatural and when it's supernatural. And I think white supremacy is a version of supernatural death. Um, and I don't think that's just me. I would say if there are any fans of Game of Thrones, or genres of vampire and zombie movies, or if you like J.K. Rowling, you may not like Harry Potter as much because J.K. Rowling has been transphobic. But if you think of the Death Eaters, in white-led popular culture, you see white people dealing with the supernatural death of whiteness as an oppressive factor. I think Black people know that in our lived reality. I think Indigenous people know that. I think immigrants who are treated in dehumanizing ways in the US know that. So when we think of death in its natural cycle, we're uncomfortable with death in the United States. I will always remember a friend of mine talking about American GIs in Vietnam whose bodies didn't decompose because they had eaten a diet that was filled with preservatives. We have an unnatural relationship with life and death in our country. And because we have an unnatural relationship with both life and death in our country, there are two things that come up as balances, love and law. So it's not lost on me that Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer, and also a Black woman who is really versed in the ways that Black women have constantly helped us reimagine how life could exist with more love. What I would say as someone who works in community as a cultural worker, academics aside, if we want to, the title of this conference is a good death. And I was thinking part of a good death is a good life. And part of having a good life is because we live in a racist society and late capitalism. Normally, when I'm teaching, I explain to people that it's hard for us to understand why our world is so wrecked, mostly because we conflate race and racism. Typically, when we're trying to understand the injustice of things, we're trying to understand racism. But when we conflate racism with race, we look at skin color instead of like basic things that happen to humans. So when I say the US is a settler culture, what I mean is it's a culture that was founded on rape, torture, imprisonment, kidnapping. And those are deeply painful human experiences. So if you happen to come to my home and you kidnap me, or you murder someone that I love, or you rape me, or you torture me, or you imprison me, I am not going to be thinking about your skin color. I'm going to be thinking about the wounds and the trauma that you gave me. If you happen to be someone who is white, I'll pause and say, as a post-colonialist, white people were some of the first colonized people, and a lot of what we say is whiteness is trauma, the trauma of losing your tradition and your culture. It's also the trauma of deep misogyny. Whiteness begins to become more dehumanized when women in European cultures were demonized. And that is the template of other oppressions that happen to people of color when that trauma goes on the road, so to speak. So I wanted to lay those things out because if we want to think about having both a good life and a good death, and to move beyond shame and blame and anger and rage, what that really means is within our healing is us thinking about most of the practices within social justice that are worth internalizing is the practice of consideration. So I want to give a thank you to Lashana and the organizers for your investment in accessibility, for example, so that many people can participate. It's radical care. Um, I would say a template in US society that is congruent in our many different identities is how mundane it is to be abused. I've met wealthy white people who came from families that were deeply abusive. So moving along with consideration into care, having a radical practice of care. Also attunement. I care a lot about attachment. In psychology, we talk about what happens when a child is raised by caregivers who do or do not attune to them. So we don't have time for me to get into secure attachment styles, avoidant, chaotic. But I think as we realize that caregiving is a lifelong enterprise, it doesn't stop with children, and that we all have to take care of our inner child, maybe the one who had experiences that were negative, that we have to sit and spend time with. And that's even more important as we think, again, if intersectionality is the GPS and life is the journey, how do we begin to understand ourselves not as one-dimensional beings, which is what the paltry offering from racist capitalism is, will be one-dimensional. Two-dimensional is maybe I'll be able to think of you as a woman of color or a trans person who is indigenous. I'm just giving you like two identities. Three-dimensional is typically that's what happens in our sensuous reality. We experience people at least as three-dimensional if we're fully functioning. But we're also, and I began with the story of ancestry in the video because we're also, we're tied epigenetically to our ancestors. And spiritually and cosmologically, we're also in the fifth dimension. So we're at least in 5 dimensions at all times. If you're in a very primitive society, you may have access to 1 dimension. You may bump up to 3 if you're really lucky. But I would say in general, and the reason why I wanted to start kind of more with admiration for the work that my mom was doing around trying to make sure that our ancestral cemetery could be honored. And she humbled me because, you know, I think I'm trying to mature, so I'm much more likely to reflect on the ways that misogyny and sexism and classism are embedded in me. So being a celebrant of my mom's intelligence, and much of what she has given me and continues to give me in this life is the ability to love and decode. We have very different politics. And at the same time, some of the most divine lessons about love I've learned from her. And so that experience of realizing for 28 years that she has not been able to clean her parents' grave because racism is so alive. And also my reflection, I didn't put it in, but I'll just share it with you now because I'm about to wrap up. I remember after moving to Seattle, again, it was startling for me to live in such a predominantly white space. And I had a very uncomfortable living arrangement in a predominantly white DIY co-op that was more like, let's live off the grid, let's do everything ourselves, which those practices didn't really work for me for a lot of different reasons. So I left with a lot of frustration. And when I was talking to my mom one day, I remember telling her, I will never live with white people again, like in my home. I will not do that again. And this will continue to be one of the most humbling experiences in my life. But my mom said, Davida Ingram, is that hate I hear in your heart? And I love that she asked me to step back into myself and to not typify, and to learn to be a wholehearted person, in a world where I might get mistreated. And when I begin to participate, based on the games of our cruel society, that it dehumanizes me. And that I appreciate it. So that's why I said life, love. Law is third on that list for me because laws do protect us when we are dehumanized. But again, in terms of that GPS and journey metaphor that I'm sharing, we began to try and find our coordinates so that we can map a new path. So thank you for thinking about that new path and having a conversation. So I'll open up the floor. How much more time do we have, Lashana?
Oh, we have 30 minutes.
Okay, great. I was hoping that we'd have enough time to have a juicy conversation.
Yeah.
There are 35 people on this webinar. I've jawed on for like 20 minutes now, so I kind of want to slow down, say hi to you. Just some quick community agreements. Because I cannot see you and I don't know what your lived experiences are, thank you for your gentleness in the chat. I am very curious about where you'd like this conversation to go. One of the questions that I had in the app was, what are some of the things that you would like to have this conversation be about? Can we just take a pause and have 3 minutes for people to drop questions in the chat? And then we'll just riff from there. It's a Sunday, so I'm okay with it being light.
Deal. Yeah, I changed the chat so that we can all chat together.
Oh, awesome.
So people can,
Thank you.
yeah, people
Thank
can
you.
share.
I also realize I speak in layers a lot, so I'm okay if you want to take a moment with questions. When we close at the end, I'll share a few events that are coming up that I also think are really great ways of thinking about education and intersectionality. And I'm also starting to look at your replies.
Davida too, in the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a Q&A.
In the bottom of the Zoom.
Do you see that little Q&A button?
Oh, there we go.
Some questions can come through there too.
Okay, sweet. I have one question that's come up.
Okay.
And I can share it. Yeah, let's wait for 2 more minutes and then I'll share it. Okay, lots of questions in the app about how to get into the live stream.
Oh, so many.
Okay, so the first question that I have is, can you speak more to the last point of being human with an open heart? I really struggle as a Black woman to not speak poorly of white culture people, but recognize that it only violently pulls pieces of me out of myself. Um, Thank you, Davina. I also love that our names are so, actually, people call me Davina sometimes. So now I'm happy that I've met a Davina in real life. Um, Davina, it's interesting. I am one of five children, um, and we're dually parented Black. So in the video, I shared that my dad's family comes from a mixed race, Black background, and I don't think that's unique. I think many African Americans have that experience. But because he came from a family where there was a splitting between folks who remained Black and people who became white, that has really deeply informed how I think about whiteness, because I really meant it. I see whiteness as cousins who have chosen to live in a false hierarchy. Now, not all white people live that way. But in terms of a forensic, I would say if we look at the recent election as a forensic, if we have 70 million white people in our country, which is a settler society that believe that racism is the only way that they can stay alive, I don't know if that is the work of Black people to change their minds. Um, when I'm being cynical, sometimes I say it would be nice if white people didn't gentrify communities of color and instead talk to their white family members that they feel like they have to escape from, because we can't escape from white supremacy. So the notion that white people are intolerant of closed-mindedness is a notion that I think might be healthy to challenge. Um, I think because I'll talk story for a moment. I learned gardening this summer, and I had a tomato plant that was never properly planted, meaning it stayed in its nursery pot, and it fruited, and it made this big tomato but it made this really big tomato. But I kept looking at that plant, and I was like, as much as I appreciate this tomato, I really wish I had planted that plant correctly. And it reminded me a lot of Black womanhood in the US, where we fruit all the time, but often in soil that's been poorly nourished and when we haven't been properly attended to. So I would say, Black woman to Black woman, I'm much more interested in your ability to practice self-love and self-care and self-compassion, and to replenish your soils and to fruit in ways that are beautiful and sweet for you. And I think when Black women are allowed that sovereignty, then that's transformative as well. Yes, we are heroic. Um, like there was a whole video that I didn't record that had a lot of different tangents, but I just kept feeling really tired working on it. But it was around like looking at Stacey Abrams and the organizing work that she did with other Black women in Georgia. And Georgia's really close to my heart because James Baldwin wrote about Georgia in the preface of Evidence of Things Not Seen. And he reminds us that it began as a penal colony. So a lot of, I'm an abolitionist. I didn't get into that too because I didn't think I had enough time. I'm an abolitionist, and I think it's really helpful to remember that white people were always too close to death when they came to the New World. That's why they were escaping Europe. And so that part of white people reconfiguring themselves, you can never do someone else's healing for them. And a lot of what we note and talk about as racism is white trauma. It's pain that needs to be healed. And as Black people, we are, it would be imprudent and emotionally unhygienic to insert ourselves into the processes that white people need to do to rematriate themselves. So to deal with the root causes of misogyny in their culture, and to also understand the ways that Europe was colonized that has made them behave poorly with other peoples to this day and to the 21st century. So Davina, I hope that answered your question.
I have to share with folks that question. came from Davina,
Oh,
and
Davina, sorry, thank you.
no, no worries. I said it like that the first time I said it, and I got a look.
I like the correction. Thank you, Davina.
And Davina is a birth worker in Seattle, and is pretty consistently in these situations of like of giving of the medical system, and so seeing all these things when you brought it right back to how Davina cares for herself, it was super poignant, especially with all the work that she does.
Yeah, and also I really love that there's a resurgence of Black healing arts. I was chatting with my mom, and she was explaining to me that my grandmother was a herbalist and the different plants that she used to take care of herself. But I think like places like Niles Edge, Wanawari, there are in terms of this when I talk about soils for Black womanhood and Black non-binary people and Black folks in general across genders and identities to flourish. There's a nice soil in Seattle for growing Blackness. The social structures that make Blackness centrifugal, meaning it pushes it out, is a real thing. The expensiveness of Seattle is a real thing. But I also think the beneficial soils of Seattle are our cultural institutions. So I got that one question in the Q&A. I see some comments. Heidi is saying, I often think about the power dynamics that I bring into a conversation through my identity. Very white passing first generation Mexican immigrant. And I've been trying really, really, really hard to untangle the parts of me that uphold white supremacy and the parts of me that are subjugated to it. I will say two things. One, thank you. We all have roots and routes that we're traveling in. Um, I would say because Blackness overcoats a lot of our conversations about race. The one drop rule in Blackness is kind of fascinating to me. I will always remember the day my god sister sent that image in the video of my grandfather with his father. And I remember looking at that video and trying to understand how an interracial family would have been possible in Arkansas in the 1930s. And so because my mom knew my father's people, she could decode for me that my great grandfather was white looking but Black. His internalized white superiority is a legacy in my family, and I actually think he's participating in the ancestral realm in that healing, because I definitely see the way he treated my father harmed my dad, and caused my dad to have a lot of psychological pain. So I think one reality that happens, I think, with people of color who are white adjacent or white looking is oftentimes people of color who are less ambiguous looking may project pain on you. I've also noticed in POC centered spaces, there can be interesting dynamics where I would say an ideal might be like in Black space is if everyone can bring their deepest, blackest heart. I've watched discomfort on all sides when more white looking Black people come into Black spaces and maybe from a space of vulnerability, share their insecurity, and then it makes everyone feel kind of shut down. So I think when we all can understand that we are 100% the identities that we're a part of, or at least when I was talking to my niece, I remember her in a really disappointed voice telling me, you know, Auntie Davida, I'm half white. And I was like, I know you're a human, not a fraction. What are you? And then I was like, you're not the only person who looks like you in the family. So that ability to have folks who hold you with compassion is important. I wouldn't encourage anyone to spend a lot of time investing in people who dehumanize you, but also to understand positionality and have a power analysis. So when we are in spaces where we're with people who are closer to the knives, so to speak, how do we make that space safer for them, and make more loving space all around?
And I think too, like, especially in caring for people at the end of their lives, like that, like pausing on that moment, like thinking about what do you bring in that room with you that you are newly aware of, that you weren't aware of, and like being able to make space for what we bring in a room, um, for people who are are vulnerable in all kinds of ways, and on the way or in the middle of a journey that we have no fucking clue about. You know, we know about death, but they're doing it, they're dying. And
Yeah.
so the ways that all of our traumas from them and from us like come together in that room, being aware of them.
I'm glad that you keep taking us out of the meta space, because I think what social theory is a meta space. And then there's the actual space with lived practices. That's really real for me. My dad just got a dementia diagnosis, and I'm stepping into a caregiving role. So I was being very elusive in the video that I created, but it was more me thinking about what are the layers of things that I'm going to work through to understand this new part of my life that is, one, taking care of someone who was traumatized, and who never got the healing that he deserved. Um, Two, taking care of my own psyche as I do that work, and doing it. The reason why I referenced abuse in my earlier comments is because I do really believe that that's a foundational experience in the US. I would say the majority of folks who live in the US have been abused in some way. And if you've been abused and you have not had access to healing tools, life and death become a lot more complicated. And so spending some time thinking about what are the practices that come with care. Like, because COVID has foregrounded mutual aid, there are some people who do caregiving work all the time. The other reality is there are people who do caregiving work begrudgingly, or they were never trained to do it well, or they've never had a chance to take care of themselves. And so that's where COVID is this really excellent metaphor, where if you don't put your mask on and wash your hands, you can't actually go in the room and bring life with you. You will bring a high likelihood of bringing death with you. That will be a probable risk. And those are things that I think that come with caregiving, that we have to have a chance to take care of our inner self, and to work through um, to work through the things that right now, theoretically, I think our theories are deficient. Because I always think of like heart head split. One of my teachers is Roger Fernandez, and he says you listen to your heart first, and then you use your head to do what your heart says. I see us doing a lot of top down, head only, not as much heart, which is why we have the complaints about woke culture, right? Like if I'm love rarely grows in the soils of judgment, which is why I said let's talk about life, love, and then law. Because if we begin with law first, um, and within social justice is centering law, it means that we may be trafficking in judgment, not love and life. So I'd much rather deal with someone who's drinking from the waters of life, which is why I use the story of my mom, because she's been a very, her love has been a love sometimes that I don't understand, but it's been consistent love. As someone who is invested in breaking generational cycles in my family, I've been much, much more interested in figuring out what it looks like to heal within, and do that healing work within, because then I'm much less likely to be accusatory or blaming of other people. I don't do that work perfectly. I fail at it regularly. I've failed at it multiple times in trying to get care for my dad, and in terms of working with my sisters so that we all can be in his care together. But I also think that that's the work right now. That is the work right now. I'm trying to get to the next questions. There's two more. And Lashana, help me because you've
Yeah.
been great.
the one that came up first was, could you elaborate a little bit more about the 5 dimensions of reality when you are engaging with healing and social justice?
Sure. So I think let's let's hang out in language for a moment.
I love that.
Um, So a lot of times I've noticed in social justice, like pictures, the graphics that we make from social justice. I do work in equity, so I don't know if everyone has seen it, but there's a picture of some children who are trying to look over a fence. And then there are different sizes, so some folks can look over the fence and see the game, and other folks couldn't. And the first time I saw that picture, I said, "Why are all the kids in this picture white if you want to talk about equity?" And then the conversation has continued, where people are like, well, the kids shouldn't be looking at the game, they should be playing the game. So we've all added more complexity, but I would probably say when we're in one-dimensional spaces, whiteness is the default. So when I say woman, you think Marilyn Monroe, not literally Marilyn Monroe, but you think a white woman in your head, because you haven't been taught that woman, and I'm using woman because that's an identity of mine, but I could easily say non-binary. Um, I also hope when you're thinking woman that you're considering that trans women and cis women all fall under the category of woman quite naturally. Um, so when we get to two-dimensional spaces, we get to words like um, woman of color. Or if you've ever seen people talk about injustice and they've done a strange linguistic thing where they say women and people of color. Which I think actually in a weird ways makes it unimaginable to think of Black women or Indigenous women or women who are multi-generation Americans. You see where I'm going with that? So I encourage us to at least be within 3 dimensions, which means that we can think of race, sexuality, gender. Fourth and fifth, it's more going into time and cosmology. And the reason why I kind of map those things out is in the US, I think it's quite typical to be in a one-dimensional reality. Like I don't know why I do this right now. I think it's because I understand abuse and I understand that you're in the most danger when you leave your abuser. So I get up in the morning and I look at Donald Trump's Twitter because I want to know when he wants to show up with a gun. But in his world, he lives in a one-dimensional world, and he is when my compassion steps in, I would say he's a very good example of what happens when an unhealed person has an incredible amount of power. So on one level, I have compassion for Donald Trump just in the sense that when you have narcissistic injuries, meaning you fractured early, someone harmed you, and you will never feel safe. You do not feel whole. And all you're doing is coping your whole life. To have this man be in his well into his seventh decade and so far from healing is sad. I mean, it's also terrifying because of the incredible amount of harm that has happened on his watch. But I will also say, the background that I have up is for a program called Love in the Time of COVID. And that's coming up on Thursday. And I spent last night doing interviews with families who have survived detention and the way that we treat immigrants. And so one important thing that's a historical fact for me in witnessing these stories is the child camps and family separations did not begin with Trump. They happened under Obama. So I don't have any confidence that these families will be treated better because we switched to Biden and Kamala Harris. Instead, if I care about life and if I care about caregiving and people having good cycles of life and death, then I have to understand the supernatural ways that our country puts death at the doorsteps of immigrant families. So there's a lot to unwork. And Trump is a symptom. He's not the primary driver. However, the part of me that is a healer, this it says, well, and in one way, I believe in gratitude. I'm grateful for him to give me a representation of what it looks like when someone who is unhealed continues on without the support and help that they need. He angers me deeply. And I'm an abolitionist, so I always say, like, whiteness came into the quote unquote new world in a state of criminality. And yet you're never the worst thing that you've ever done. Like, you, people do bad things all the time. As an abolitionist, I just believe we ask, how do we create a world that's safe, that's worth living in? And that's everyone's responsibility. Um, Help me out with questions, Lasana. I'm seeing one from Gina, and I'm just reading. I'm trying to read and go along. And I know you
That
have
was
kind
the
of.
one we just did.
Okay.
I just I trimmed it.
Okay, great.
I trimmed it. Well, we have 7 minutes left, and I was wondering. So the ways as we continue out into our non-Zoom lives, um, with everything that is going on, like how a lot of folks in this community and that will be watching this are educators in some way. All of us are educators. We all teach in some way. Some of us have good teachings and teachings that could be better. We have plenty of bad examples out there. But as we move forward, in our thought process of creating content, of talking with people, when we are not thinking of everyone, um, like, can we talk a little bit about how that lands for people when they are presented with educational material or content or conversation where they are on the outside and not included?
That's a great. I think that might be a great way to wrap up. Um, this is where I had a really this weekend, as this is the capstone of a really busy and fun week of trying to figure out how to have rich conversations in the middle of a pandemic. But in getting ready for a program, the program on Thursday for 11, the time of COVID, is called Ask an Abolitionist. And I wanted that to be really legible. So I started with some children that I've been working with. There is a mom who was murdered by the Seattle Police Department in 2017, a Black mother named Charlena Lyles. And after her death, I began to work with other departments in the city to see how we could participate in healing. I know SPD, the Seattle Police Department, is part of why Charlena's not around, and I figured we have to have a counterbalance to that, which is if we have the forces of death, we also have to have the forces of life. And so I've been working with these young people around social justice issues and arts. And so they did their interviews for Ask an Abolitionist. And one of the really important things that came up in the conversation that gets to your question, Lashana, is where do we begin? We begin with safety. I would say if we want to live in a world that has social justice, if we want to live in a world where prisons are no longer possible, then we have to live in a world where there's safety. So that the interview process that we did with the kids, they interviewed Nikita Oliver, who's a local activist in Seattle who ran for mayor. Nikita's an incredible educator. They also interviewed an incredible lawyer named Nick Allen. Nick works at Columbia Legal Services. They also interviewed two artists. So Dakota Camacho, who's a non-binary person from who's Matau, and also another non-binary person who is Iranian and I'm trying to remember Cyray's ethnicities. So the young people got a chance to really have a rich conversation about what does it mean to live in a world without prisons. And you could tell the conversation kind of blew their mind. Like there was one young person who was like, I don't know, when people are wrong, they have to be punished. I read it in the Bible, and we had this fantastic conversation with them that is definitely a to be continued.
Yeah.
But really, one of the great things about having young people as my teachers is they taught me that, hey, Miss Abolitionist, this isn't understandable to me. You got to break it down and make it simple. And you always make it simple, but not simpler, right? So my job is to make it understandable, but not dumbed down. So I was up early. They made me come alive with trying to make this idea, not proselytize for them. I don't need them to become abolitionists, but I want them to understand who an abolitionist is. Because if they go to a U.S. school system, they will tell you an abolitionist is someone from the past. John Brown was an abolitionist. You're not going to think someone is an abolitionist. But what I ended up telling them that day during the workshop was, okay, my background is museums, which is like, I remember my mentor being like, why are you doing museum studies? Isn't that where objects go to die? And I was like, I don't agree with that. However, in working with families whose loved ones have been stolen into that system, one of the things that I have definitely discovered is that when you talk about abolition, you are talking about stolen time. You are talking about people who've never had safety, and they're not going to have safety with prisons. And so in my mind, what I told those young people is, if abolitionists are allowed to keep working with people to create safety, I can imagine a world, maybe not even 20 years from now, where all prisons are museums. They are places where we enshrine and entomb the idea that we cannot be safe. And we tell the stories of people who have had so much time stolen. I'm working with a sister whose brother went to a bathroom without a mask on in prison. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning. He went to the bathroom. He was told he didn't have a mask on. He went back to his room. He thought everything was fine. And then guards burst into his room at 3 o'clock in the morning, pepper sprayed him, handcuffed him, broke his eye socket, and he's been in solitary confinement for 120 days. When I say that Blackness is being close to death, it's stories like that I'm referencing. And to work with his sister and to do Reiki sessions with her, to do family support with her, and to also to hold deeply in my heart that the experience that she is going through and millions of other families with loved ones in prison is going through, that type of sadness and misery can come to an end, is an important part of some of the caregiving and the work of dealing with death. Because I think if you're an abolitionist, you're a death doula in a very different way. But I think what you're trying to bring to an end is prisons. Prisons have to die. And we have to figure out not just the conversation about, well, let's get rid of prisons, but how do we make a safe world that's filled with consideration, care, attunement, and nurturing? So those are the things that I, in my practices, that's what I'll be deepening over the next years for sure. And I think we're at time.
We are. We are. Holy shit, that was great.
Thank you.
I wish we were in the same room.
I know. You know what? I was like, the fifth dimension is also being disembodied. So I think we're all in the fifth dimension on Zoom. And thank you for making spaces for connection. We can always,
Yeah,
we can always find ways to connect.
we can.
Yeah. And thank you for building connection in this moment. It's healing.
Thank you. Thank you for, I mean, when people start to discover all that you do, they will understand when I say thank you for doing this right now. You are doing so many things for humans right now. So thank you for sharing with us.
Well, humans are loving me very deeply right now. I like that this pandemic is hard. Mm-hmm. It's really, really hard. And I woke up a little bit in mourning space. However, I've never been so heart-centered in my life. So doing a lot of heart-centered work has been very healing for me. And this is part of it. So thank you. Thank you for just leaving some space to talk about it.
Yeah. I hope that today is kind to you, and I will share with folks too some other links and notes about what's going on.
Sweet. And I'm very glad that I met Lashana. Lashana and I are on the African American Health Board, and I appreciate the work that's happening in that space so much.
it's so fun to like look forward to a Zoom meeting on a Monday night. Like,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
all right. Have a beautiful day. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Goodbye.